Um,
Go ahead. Yes.
just said maybe on my screen share.
Oh, yes. I'll make you the co-host. That should work. Well, good morning, everyone. We're here with Bobby Click from the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. If you are watching this presentation on our YouTube channel later, we hope that you find the information helpful. Please know that archived webinars may not be used towards COVA's voluntary victim advocacy certification. If you're watching live today, I will put a certificate of attendance. I'll download that in the chat as we get a little bit toward the end of the presentation. And so, Bobby, please take it away.
Great, perfect. Can y'all see my screen okay? Awesome. All right, well, my name is Bobby Click, and I'm the Vice President for an organization known as the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, which is housed in downtown Denver. I've been with the center for about 3 years now. I joined as an associate legal counsel before moving into a couple director roles, and then ultimately the VP role I'm in now. I do have one of the other directors online today. I'm going to have her introduce herself. And today we're just going to go through what the U.S. Center for Safe Sport is, what we do, some of the numbers and reports we receive, so some of the data, and then just ways we're looking at collaborating with organizations in Colorado and around the country moving forward. So with that, I'll just have Jocelyn Schaefer introduce herself to everybody.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Jocelyn. I'm actually currently in the West Coast, so it's about 7:30 this morning. So cheers. I'll drink my coffee. I'm the director of intake over at the center. We effectively receive all the reports of abuse and then get them rolling in whatever way. Connect with law enforcement, connect folks with services, talk through our process. So similar in the advocacy role in that we're talking about options and people's rights through our process, engaging interest and participation. So I oversee that department. We've received just over 5,000 reports this year. So we've been busy. I've worked previously in the victim advocacy world prior to working here. I started in March of 2018 doing direct service too. So I know the struggles, I know the rewards, and we've been trying to implement all of those things within our process too. So I'll jump in, talk through, happy to talk with you all offline if there's questions. So yeah, good morning and looking forward to this training.
Great. So just as a kind of start off is like what the U.S. Center for Safe Sport is and what we do, because we have found that even though we've been around for about 5 years now, a lot of people outside the movement, as I call it, so that's the Olympic movement, don't really have an understanding of who the center is or what it is that we do. And so that's always a great place for me to start. So what the U.S. Center for Safe Sport is a nonprofit based, like I said, in Denver, that is federally tasked with resolving allegations of misconduct within the Olympic movement, right? So what we have to do is receive those allegations and then respond to those allegations. We also serve as an educational resource for sports and an audit and compliance standard organization for what we refer to as national governing bodies, which are organizations like USA Gymnastics, USA Hockey, so those individual sports that are encompassed under the Olympic movement umbrella. And now when I say the Olympic movement umbrella, it's a pretty big umbrella. A lot of people don't realize, but right now in the US, we estimate nearly 14 million people are involved within the Olympic movement itself. So that is about 4% of the American population is involved within the Olympic movement, and the U.S. Center for Safe Sport would have the ability to investigate and potentially take action against those 14 million people. So with that, this is, kind of an idea of, founded in 2017, we're a nonprofit, we're completely independent from the Olympic movement. So even though we do have some oversight over them, we're not, we don't report to them, we have oversight over those organizations. We have the exclusive authority, right? So federal law actually codified the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, giving it exclusive authority to conduct the administrative investigations into sexual abuse and misconduct within the Olympic and Paralympic movement. So think of USA Gymnastics, right? If Larry Nassar were to allege to have engaged in the conduct he engaged in now, it would be up to the U.S. Center for Safe Sport to investigate whether or not he is fit to participate within sport. USA Gymnastics would not conduct those investigations. We'll talk a little bit more about how we coordinate with law enforcement, because I want to make sure you understand that this doesn't supersede or take the place of a law enforcement investigation. This is strictly an administrative investigation that is looking to determine whether or not someone should have the ability to participate within that Olympic movement. So this is what I call the safe sport model, right? Like the pillars that make up what we do in our mission to eliminate abuse within the Olympic movement, right? So individual accountability, and that is the keystone of the response and resolution department. So the individual you're hearing from today, myself, Jocelyn, Brian Tomlinson, he's one of our directors of investigation. Our responsibility is investigating those allegations of misconduct that involve individuals within the Olympic sport. And if we make findings in sanctioning those individuals appropriately, right? So individual accountability. We also have a very strong prevention and education department. So we've trained 3 million plus individuals within the Olympic movement on things of emotional and physical abuse, how to recognize red flags for potential sexual abuse, things of that nature. So really trying to help, because, prevention education is so important when you're trying to empower individuals within a movement and then enact a culture change within such a large organization. And then organization accountability, that's what I was talking about with our audit and compliance team. So we have a team dedicated to going out and making sure that those NGBs, so those governing bodies, the ones responsible for each of those individual sports, are handling cases appropriately, have appropriate policies and procedures in place. So they're going out on a regular basis and auditing those NGBs administratively, and then actually going out to events as well. So it's an entire scope, right, to try to prevent abuse, address abuse within Olympic movement, and then hold those individuals and organizations accountable. So I think it's really important, each of these kind of to the piece to the puzzle. So, and I'll let Brian kind of jump in here, because what I always want to point out is, especially when we're getting to know an organization or getting our information out there, just how experienced the individuals that work with our organization actually are, right? We may be 5 years old, but the organization is not made up of individuals who have 5 years of experience at this point, right? There's a lot more there. So I'll let Brian kind of jump in and talk through just some of the backgrounds of the investigators that he has on his team over on the investigative side of the house.
Thanks, Bobby. Good morning, everyone. Sorry about my delay. I had to navigate the interwebs over to meet you all. My name is Brian Tomlinson. I'm one of 2 directors of investigations here at the center. A quick background on me and the structure of our division, and then I'll get into the slides there. I joined the center in 2018 after a career in higher education, doing dean of students work, sexual misconduct investigations, behavior intervention work. I joined when we were really small. When we were assessing the needs of the center, we're going to be primarily served best by folks with administrative backgrounds and that university experience. And there certainly is a good number of cases that we have that fit that skill set. But as we grew and received more reports and assessed what ultimately the movement was going to be presenting to us in these reports that we received, we definitely needed to diversify our staff and diversify their experiences and grow the organization, grow the management structure, and as any new organization, develop standing operating procedures, et cetera. So I was promoted a couple of times into the director role, and then we hired another director of investigation, Eric Williams, who couldn't join us this morning, but also internal promotion. His background was many years in the FBI, conducting civil rights investigations, terrorism work. He was their congressional liaison for a good number of time and working with youth as well. And before that, he's a Navy vet and a lawyer. So 2 diverse backgrounds there running the organization. We have 8 assistant directors, all with varying degrees of experience, and 30 investigators at present. We also work with a on any given day, close to 30 external investigators as well, depending upon the needs of our cases. And they have all sorts of backgrounds too. So a few highlights of those staff. On this slide here, I'm highlighting some of the former law enforcement experience that our staff have. As we grow the division and hire new staff, the average number of experience, of course, changes with every new person that comes in. But right now, we're averaging over 15 years experience here with the center. And you can see on this slide here, we have local law enforcement folks who have done work on FBI task force, like our staff here that worked with the Aurora, Colorado Police Department. We have folks who have long-standing careers, retired from federal law enforcement with the FBI, with Homeland Security. Lots of our staff have done human trafficking work in a number of different capacities. And we have staff who are former forensic interviewers. Of course, they still maintain that training, but we're doing forensic interviews in a different space. And then everywhere in between. On the next slide here, I want to highlight some of our staff that come from the field of child protection. These are just 3 of our staff currently working with us, but we have a good number of staff with this background too. Close to 10 years of experience in the child protective space, from conducting investigations, serving young people through the Child Protective Services. We have staff actually have done administrative investigations in the Colorado prison system as well. So another unique set of experience there. What we don't have here is, as I mentioned before, some of the initial staff working with decades of experience in higher education background. So lots of different experiences here, lots of different types of cases that we can address based on just the experience of our staff. And as Bobby mentioned, being only a 5-year-old organization, I'd probably take this staff up against any organization that's been around for decades, if not longer than that, and be really pretty pleased with the amount of experience the staff have come here to the center. One of the big things that attract them, of course, is the mission. And Bobby will talk a lot more about our mission and how we address it with our work here in a moment. But that's the one thing that they are uniquely united behind, is serving this critical need in the Olympic movement. So thanks, Bobby.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Brian. So we're going to get into a little bit of the data so you understand why there's an organization like the U.S. Center for Safe Sport that has a total of 120 plus individuals on staff. More than half of those individuals are dedicated to the Response and Resolution Division. Those on Brian's team, those on Jocelyn's team, those 30 investigators in-house, nearly 30 external investigators. So when you think of it, nearly 60 investigators at any given time investigating those allegations of misconduct within the Olympic movement. It's important to understand why. And these numbers help people understand. I just like this Q4, a partial Q4 number here, because it gives me a little bit of like optimism that at some point our numbers are going to go down a little bit, even though I know we're not there yet. But this highlights the path of the center with regards, and the history of the center with regards to reporting numbers. We opened our doors in Q2 of 2017. 85 reports of misconduct right in Q2. Q3, we were open the entire quarter, 70 allegations of misconduct. Those reports were received by the center. Fast forward until 2021, and you start to see those numbers rise, right? Like you can see some dips in 2020. I'd imagine everybody on this call understands what happened in Q2 of 2020 that really had those numbers dropping as we saw the pandemic shutter the doors of a lot of organizations and, the Olympic movement. But as soon as those doors open, we're seeing those numbers rise. And right now we're averaging more than 100 reports of misconduct per week, right? So that means some individual is contacting our organization to report allegations of either emotional abuse, physical abuse, or sexual abuse within the Olympic movement. That's a lot of reports that the U.S. Center for Safe Sport is receiving. You can see Q3 of 2022 was the busiest quarter we've seen to date. 1,431 reports were made to the U.S. Center for Safe Sport when we open our doors. These numbers are through October. 632 reports were received by the U.S. Center for Safe Sport in October. So you can tell that number is going to be high as we end this year as well. We're on pace to get close to, if not potentially exceed, 6,000 reports of misconduct just this calendar year alone, which is just an astronomical number when you think about what we were receiving in the quarters of 2017. We now receive on a weekly basis the amount of reports we were receiving on a quarterly basis in 2017. This kind of gives you a bit of a breakdown so you can see that we're dipping, where we dip here and dip there, but we're not anywhere near where we were before. And that's a good thing, right? What we know is when it's a new organization, 5 years old, still pretty new, we want to see these numbers up because that means we're building confidence and understanding within that movement, right? People are confident within us as an organization to bring misconduct to us. And they have a better understanding of what needs to be reported, how to recognize those potential red flags or misconduct. So it's a great indicator that those individuals involved in the movement are gaining that understanding and confidence that we want them to have as these numbers go up. At some point, yeah, we want to see them plateau and even potentially dip as we work in that preventative space. But right now, that increase in numbers is positive for us. But you can see how many reports and how many cases we've had this year. Average per month, 475. That's up from 309 last year, which was up dramatically from even 2020 and 2019. So this is a great kind of slide for us. We've resolved, just so you guys know, almost 12,000 cases at this point. Sanctions, you can see that we levy are formal warnings, limited participation, probation, suspension, ineligibility, and permanent ineligibility, right? That's important. So what the center can do is if we find someone is engaged in misconduct, we can take action against that individual. The most severe action that we can take is called permanent ineligibility. And what that means is we are permanently removing that person's ability to participate within any Olympics movement, sport, or NGB. So if we remove someone from gymnastics, they can no longer coach at a USA Gymnastics gym. They can no longer attend USA Gymnastics events, but they also cannot go to any other Olympic movement sport and participate there as well. And you can see down there at the bottom that total published cases, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But those are cases of individuals who are currently published on the center's centralized disciplinary database, which essentially serves as a registry for the U.S. Center for Safe Sport for individuals who are under some type of temporary measure while we investigate cases, or some individual who has been temporarily or permanently removed from sport via a sanction. So this is just a snapshot, right? I like to just show a snapshot of people, of how many cases are currently with the center and where they stand. You can see how many cases we have open at just over 1,000 cases, how many total closed cases we have, total cases to date. So the center has opened more than 12,000 cases in the 5 years of its existence, right? Like that is, a pretty shocking number for most individuals. And they ask, okay, so how many cases are you opening? How many cases are you resolving, right? What's the center really doing? Because so many people think of the Olympic movement as just that upper echelon of elite athletes, but we extend all the way down to that grassroots level sport. And 12,000 cases in 5 years is significant. You can see from those slides that we presented earlier, a lot of those 12,000 cases have came in the last year, 2 years. So this number is a little misleading when you think of how many cases we're having, because if you come to us next year and we show you the same slide this time of the year, that's going to be 18,000 cases or so, right? It's going to rise dramatically because our first couple of years when we were opening our doors were a little bit slower. But you can see, and we'll talk about our process in just a second, but cases under investigation, 450 cases nearly actively under investigations right now, under review. So it's a great kind of snapshot of how many cases there are with the center and where they're currently at. So I'll let Brian kind of take over here for a second, just given his work in investigations, to kind of walk you through what we sum up as the 5 steps of the R&R process, just so you kind of have an understanding of what happens when a case comes in our door, all the way to the point where we resolve that case and reach some level of resolution.
Very good. Thanks, Bobby. And what I'll do is I'm just going to provide sort of a high-level overview. And then once we're through slides here, Jocelyn and I are certainly happy to answer any detailed questions about each of the steps. We identify 3 phases of our process: our intake and preliminary inquiry phase, our investigations phase, and our adjudication and resolutions phase. And within those three phases, there are 5 distinct steps, each of them having some sort of mesh point. If you use a sports analogy, there between each process. So step one for us is just receiving the report. And in the earliest days of the center, that was coming in, via snail mail. We get a few of those yet still, but a lot of times emails and phone calls. As we have grown and increased our capacity pretty significantly, receive the reports online. We receive most of those via our online reporting form. Most of the time, those coming from folks who have a mandate to report those matters within the Olympic movement. Whether it's because it's some form of child abuse or child sexual abuse that they're required to report to us, or because they otherwise are required to report general sexual misconduct matters over to us in the movement. We still get a few of those via email and phone, but most of them are online. It can be anonymous, and we can go into some more detail later if you have questions about that. But more times than not, it's someone that we call a third-party reporter. So someone who has an obligation to make a report is submitting to us information they know about the matter that's been made aware to them. From there, then usually within the first 48 hours or so, 48 business hours or so, we conduct initial intake, and that is assessing whether or not we have personal jurisdiction over the person believed to be as the terms we use, respondent, the accused individual, and whether or not we have subject matter jurisdiction. Jocelyn and her team make those determinations, and then, if necessary, move the case on into preliminary inquiry, which remains with Jocelyn's team, where we're doing some initial minimal facts gathering. Who are the claimants here? What's their interest in participating? What's their level of involvement as far as participation may go? And what initial information is immediately available with her team? And then it is prepared to go to an assignment list. And one of the things that we were really pretty pleased about is, as you see the reports increase, a graph that we don't have on here that points the downward direction is the amount of time it's taken for a case to sit on our assignment list. In the earliest days of the center, as we were staffing up, sometime it took a little while to get a case in there. I was working on the assignment list this morning now, and I think the average number of days currently cases on our list waiting to be assigned is about anywhere from 14 to 17 days that a case is sitting on the assignment list before it's assigned. So a tremendous improvement in that process for us. And that's one of the more critical mesh points in our process, is moving from PI into investigations. We have a soft handoff, we call it, where our staff discuss what are the needs of the case, but then it truly becomes a distinct separate phase of our process for one of those investigators to take the case and do all the things that they need to do to make sure we're gathering all the facts in a fair, thorough, neutral way. That usually, of course, you might imagine, involves interviews. We've gotten pretty experienced here at doing this virtually. We were doing that before COVID, but definitely doing a lot of it now. But we are, fortunately, able to go on site and do a lot of interviews in person with folks, especially minors. We try pretty hard to prioritize that when we can. But what we have found is, minors do pretty well virtually. There's still some things we'd like to, continue to improve on in that space, but for the most part, that works really, really well, having a minor on video. We do record our interviews and gather all the information associated with that file, and it ends up in an investigation report. And that report then is handed on to the final phase of our process, where it's reviewed by two different sets of staff, actually, the supervising assistant director and then our legal team, to be sure that we have all the information we really should have here in a thorough investigation. And then that legal team will apply policies. Investigators don't determine whether or not policy was violated, but they will determine what facts led us to believe occurred or didn't occur. And then based on those findings, our legal team will apply policy. And then the final stage of that process within step 5 there is assigning a sanction. There's a team case resolution committee of which all 3 of us are on, as well as others meet actually on Wednesdays, usually, not today, but on most Wednesdays, where we are actually deciding the outcomes of those cases and assigning sanctions. So very good. And again, I said at the end of the slides here, we can dive into the details on the process if you like.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. And so that's kind of like our process, what I just refer to soups and nuts, boiled down to that 5 steps. So people have kind of an overview of what happens when a case comes in. So when we get a case out and resolved. and knowing how many cases the center moves through on a yearly basis, we've developed a pretty efficient but thorough process with regards to how and what we do in those cases. Brian didn't touch on it, but our investigative reports can be pretty exhaustive. When I say exhaustive, I mean in the thousands of pages when they're including exhibits and things of that nature. So very, very thorough investigations. And we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about how that investigation interacts with those investigations that may be going on with law enforcement or other organizations. But before we do that, one of the things I always just have to highlight in any presentation I give is what you've heard me call the CDD, which is the Centralized Disciplinary Database, which to me is a very unique thing that the center does in its space that I think is beneficial not only to the movement, but it's really intended to be beneficial to everyone. It's a public database that lists individuals who have been removed from sports. So if you go to our website right now, there's over 1,850 individuals listed. It will list their name, their state, the sport, the restriction or sanction that's been levied against them, and then what the allegations or findings in the case were, which is very important, right? So when you think about it, 1,850 individuals listed on a public database puts the center's registry above several states' sex offender registries, right? We have more people listed on that than some states do there. And this is publicly available to any individual that wants to go on there. It's searchable by name, by state, by sport. You can do any of that. And what's important, and the reason I think it's unique to the centers, when you think about it, the center is a nonprofit private organization. And we are putting people on this centralized disciplinary database who have not been charged with any crime, who may never be charged with any crime. But because we're federally authorized to do so, we're being given significant protection. So people are not, able to sue us, right? If you think about it, if a private organization decides it's going to post a list of individuals within a movement that it's saying engaged in sexual misconduct, they may be subject to some level of litigation or liability, not the center. Congress specifically put that ability within our authority because they want to make sure that we're able not only to mitigate the risk within the movement, but any of those other organizations, individuals outside the movement can also look into this. And what I tell people all the time, this doesn't ping on a background check, right? The CDD is so useful as a tool for any individual to look at or any organization to look at if there are sports involved or minors involved, because I can guarantee you there are people on that list that would not show up on any type of negative background check, no red flags. And the reason for that is the center investigates a lot of things that are not necessarily illegal. We don't have a statute of limitations, and we don't have a jurisdictional limitations regarding geography, so we can investigate cases or allegations from across the globe. So what I tell people a lot of times is what you'll find on the CDD could be someone who's engaged in illegal conduct, but then, as a lot of people that are watching this understand, things like grooming and manipulation, most states have not caught up to what we understand now as significant red flags to potential abuse or those precursors to abuse. The center has the ability to investigate and resolve those allegations based on the grooming itself. So I'm talking about gifting, inappropriate text messages, even if they're not in sexual nature, but the frequency, the subject matter, the gifting, the isolation, all of those things that we now recognize as those potential precursors to abuse violate our code of conduct at the U.S. Center for Safe Sports. So we have taken action up to and including permanent expulsion from sport against people who were engaging in grooming, but there was no indication that they had yet engaged in physical sexual abuse, which made it difficult for law enforcement to get involved and take action against those individuals. So with that said, CDD, I'd encourage anybody that's watching this to go to the U.S. Center for Safe Sports website, take a look at the CDD. There are people on there from Colorado. You can sort it. You can see who those individuals are, what the allegations or findings against them were. It's a great resource, right? But the people that are on there, people who have temporary measures that the center has determined are a risk to sport that we have to mitigate while we're investigating, right? So we're putting in a temporary suspension, or we're limiting an individual's ability to coach minor athletes during that time, right? They're on there. Cases where we're sanctioning individuals like by suspension, ineligibility, or permanent ineligibility. Those individuals are listed on that CDD. They'll be up there, right? And you can see all that information. Now, it's important to know that not all temporary measures or sanctions are posted on the website, right? So I'll kind of on this next slide show you that there are things we don't publish, right? So we don't publish temporary measures that are specific to parties. We impose a lot of no contact directives, right? So saying like, hey, respondent who is the individual accused of misconduct, you can't have any contact with this claimant, the person who's alleged to have been the subject of that misconduct, right? We don't post that on our website because it's not, it's not impactful on the broader sport community. It's individual specific. We impose those suspensions or those broader sport community restrictions on the website. We also don't publish things like formal warnings or probation. Those don't impact an individual's ability to participate within sport. We also have made a determination at the center that we're not going to publish minors. So if a respondent is or was a minor at the time of the misconduct, we're not going to publish their information to the website. So that kind of gives you an idea. So every case that the center has resolved, even with sanctions, is not listed on that website. Every case in which the center has imposed temporary measures is not necessarily on the website, on the CDD, but there are nearly 2,000 people listed on that website today, and every one of those individuals has either been removed from sport or had their ability restricted because of allegations that the center's investigator made findings against. That's a big list. Every one of those individuals has some relationship to the Olympic movement. They were coaches, they were athletes, they were employees of a sports organization. So it's a great opportunity to go in there to take a look at it to see if there's anybody on there that your organization may interact with or anything of that nature, because what we've seen are there are people on that list that may have moved into a non-Olympic sport or some other type of context. So we're really getting the CDD out there as a resource to organizations and individuals. So again, I'd encourage anybody to take a look at it when you have that opportunity. So one of the things I love to talk about, right, before we sum it up with how we're trying to coordinate and cooperate with individuals outside the movement, so those organizations, is just to take a look at a couple cases where the cooperation and the coordination between the center and external organizations led to what I think are some pretty great results in our mission in mitigating and eliminating risk and abuse within sport, but then also just really eliminating and potentially mitigating risks that exist in sports in general. So this first case that I like to use is involving an individual named Rich Fellers, right? I don't usually use names, right? I usually avoid using names, but this is a case that you can go online and find a lot of facts on this because there's been a lot of news coverage. There's been a lot of, PSAs released by the claimant's family. Law enforcement has made some releases. So there's a lot of information available for consumption to the public out there. So I like to use these so we can get a little bit more into the details, but you can see that police report right on Monday, June 7th, 2021. The police arrested Richard Franklin Feller, 61, out of Oregon City, multiple indictments for second-degree sexual assault. They say over the course of a long investigation lasting several months with witnesses in multiple states, they established that Fellers had a sexual relationship with a female victim who was 17 years old, and that Fellers was her horse trainer, and the alleged crimes occurred at the victim's apartment located in Portland, right? So this is kind of some background on this case. Richard Fellers is an Olympic level athlete. He is a medalist in the Olympics. He competes in equestrian. He, as a lot of equestrians do, had a horse farm where he trained and engaged with other, athletes who, had access to that farm. The victim in this case was one of those athletes that worked there. She was his trainer, and he also worked as her trainer, right? So he engages in sexual abuse with this 17-year-old and is ultimately charged in 2021. That doesn't tell the whole story, right? That's the story from the police. If you go down like that next paragraph, this is a release from the claimant's family themselves saying that their daughter made a difficult decision to agree to talk with Safe Sport following 6 months of U.S. equestrian members calling Safe Sport to report her situation. She spoke with Safe Sport. She wasn't ready to talk to law enforcement. And then ultimately Safe Sport and law enforcement worked together to release the law enforcement hold that Safe Sport could interview her and temporarily suspend the assailant. So what they were saying is Safe Sport got this report. As mandatory reporters, we immediately reported this to law enforcement to say, hey, we've received allegations that there's an adult who may be sexually abusing a minor athlete. Law enforcement reaches out to that claimant. That claimant says, I'm not interested in talking with you. So law enforcement at that point in time is unable to move forward with their investigation. They let us know that. They're like, look, we're not going to be able to move forward with this law enforcement investigation, Safe Sport. You guys are welcome to move forward with your investigation. That kind of shows the cooperation that we have and the coordination we have and like to have with law enforcement so that we're not impeding or negatively impacting a law enforcement investigation. So we spent about 6 months, like reaching out to this claimant, just talking to her, explaining who we are, explaining who our process is, and just walking her through that slowly until she found her voice and was comfortable to say, you know what, I want to talk with you, Safe Sport. I want to provide you the details of what happened to me. And we say, great. We were very intentional. We assigned an investigator who had significant law enforcement background. So he talks with her, he gets this information the whole time, still making mandatory reports to law enforcement as we gather new information. And as the center was wrapping up that interview with the claimant, she says, you know what? I'm ready to talk to law enforcement, right? Like, you know, you've explained all this to me. And if your investigator, if law enforcement is like him, I want to talk to them too, because I want to make sure they're in a position to take action against this individual when all is said and done. So it was that coordination between the claimant and Safe Sport and law enforcement that really facilitated an investigation against an individual who is currently awaiting trial for sexually abusing his athlete. So this occurred within the context of sport. And if Safe Sport had not been that kind of coordination between the claimant and law enforcement, I don't know what would have happened with this case. The other aspect that is important is it took a decent amount of time in this case for law enforcement to charge. They had to finish their investigation, gather their facts before he was ultimately charged. During that time period, the center had suspended Rich Fellers from participation in the sport. So we had taken away that avenue that we saw him use to exploit and abuse athletes. We were able to take that away, suspend him, publish him on this database, remove his ability to have access to those athletes, all while law enforcement was continuing their investigation. As soon as they charged him, we were able to, remove him from sport on a permanent basis because the existence of a criminal charge is a violation of the Safe Sport Code itself. So we can take that action against an individual without having to wait until law enforcement charges. So that's really important. But again, this is just a really good example of when the center kind of gap fills and is able to take action and facilitate the potential law enforcement investigation against individuals. And again, Mr. Fellers is an Olympic level athlete. So it was, great for us to be able to do that. Here's another one. This involves an individual named Alex Fritz. Mr. Fritz was an Olympic level climbing coach and athlete. So he was involved in USA climbing, which is a part of the Olympic movement. He was ultimately charged with multiple counts of rape of a child, very, very serious, egregious charges. He, as of, when we were writing this, he was in jail on a $500,000 bond. It's my understanding he's getting ready to plead and is going to spend a significant amount of time in prison for the misconduct. What is interesting in this case is a little bit different than Fellers. As in Fellers, this started with the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. We received allegation of misconduct. Following our mandatory reporting obligations, we immediately reported this to law enforcement. Law enforcement, because this happened in multiple jurisdictions, because there wasn't, a lot of information available, was not able to move forward with the case at the initial mandatory report. So what they said, as in Fellers, was like, hey, Safe Sport, appreciate the mandatory report. We are going to open a case. In the meantime, you're welcome to go ahead and continue your investigation. This is exactly what we did. We continued our investigation, started assigned an investigator, started talking to claimants and witnesses, not only in the Washington area, but kind of, around the country, continued to make those mandatory reports to law enforcement. After a few of those mandatory reports to local law enforcement and also the FBI, they say, hey, hold on a second. There's a lot of smoke here, and the information you've given us now facilitates an investigation. So we want you guys to stop your investigation. Don't any of you more any witnesses or potential claimants. Turn that information over to us, and we're going to pick up and run with the investigation from here. And that's exactly what we do. We stop our investigation. We provide any and all files that we have that are appropriate to law enforcement, so they know exactly who we talked to, what they said. So again, trying to expedite and facilitate that investigation. And that's where it gets kind of unique in Fritz from there. So they assign an ADA when they ultimately charge him, who is actually safe sport trained. And this assistant district attorney actually used his knowledge of the Safe Sport Code and the Center for Safe Sport within the Olympic movement to his benefit, and to make sure that appropriate actions were taken against Fritz while he was awaiting trial. So what he did was he argued that things like he shouldn't have access to any athletes. So the judge in his bond restrictions limited his ability to have access to athletes or any USA climbing facility or Olympic movement facilities. They also made sure that they really demonstrated that power imbalance and how Fritz posed a higher risk to the community because he exploited power he had over an individual. He was sexually abusing these athletes he was coaching. And so what this prosecutor was able to argue is, look at, he violated this Safe Sport Code. They tell you that the power imbalance that exists between a coach and an athlete, when exploited, demonstrates significant risk to the community. He was able to argue that to a judge in bail hearing or in bond hearings, in release hearings, to show what kind of risk exists. And the judge understood. So in his bond order, he's saying things like, this individual poses a more significant risk to the community because he exploited a power imbalance that exists and is inherent between a coach and an athlete within sport. Was basically quoting from the U.S. Center for Safe Sports Code when he's saying, because of that, I'm going to have the bond at a certain level of $500,000 bond. And not only that, but he's not going to have access to all of these facilities because that was his avenue of abuse. So again, a great result that if the U.S. Center for Safe Sport hadn't been involved, hadn't received this report and engaged in the investigation, I don't know exactly what would have happened, but we were able to do that, facilitate this law enforcement investigation where this individual is going to plead to multiple counts of rape of a child and is going to serve significant prison time for what he did, right? That's a win for the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, right? That collaboration, that facilitation, that's a win. That's us accomplishing our core mission, making sport safer, but then also promoting safety within the community as a whole. And as in Fellers, what's important here is you see that we were able to remove Fritz from sport more than a year prior to his arrest. So before he was ever charged with a crime, because we had investigated and we were facilitating this investigation, we were able to temporarily suspend him and remove him from the Olympic movement well before law enforcement had gathered enough information to charge, over a year. So that's a year that he didn't have access to athletes or USA climbing gyms or USA climbing competitions and was posted on a public database. What we've seen is when we post people on that public database, it can also facilitate reporting from other individuals. So it's, again, a great outcome for the U.S. Center for Safe Sport and law enforcement here. So those are the two case studies that I love to use because there's a lot of information out in the public. You're welcome to go and you type in the name Rich Fellers, you type in the name Alex Fritz, you're going to see this information, a lot of this information pop up. I'd encourage you to take a look at it because it really does highlight the ability of the U.S. Center for Safe Sport to kind of step in and gap fill or facilitate when cases are ongoing or when situations where there may not be a current pending charge. So that kind of leads me into the last slide that I have, that how we're exploring collaboration. As you can see in those two case studies, collaboration is so important for the U.S. Center for Safe Sport because it helps us really accomplish our mission. So what we've done, and the reason we're doing this webinar, is so people understand who we are and what we do and how we can work together, right? So one of the things we've done, and we've done this in states across the country, providing center materials to CAC clients. So basically what we're doing is we're providing materials to those CACs, And those CACs are then providing center materials to individuals who come in to report or who may be coming into a forensic interview or sometimes. They want to make sure those people understand who the center is and that the center may present another avenue to address misconduct, right? So law enforcement may not be able to do anything. Law enforcement may do something. There's a, but that's a great aspect for us. So there, that's in Texas, that's in, Pennsylvania, that's in Maryland. These are states that we provided CACs with materials from the center and that we're working really closely with them. What I've been touching on with those case studies is a resource when law enforcement investigations end or charges not brought, even if that's because they don't have enough information at the time and they'll bring charges later. We tell people like the U.S. Center for Safe Sport can be an avenue of resolution. No statute of limitations, no jurisdictional limitations. We also use a preponderance of the evidence standard, which is a significantly lower standard than the evidence standard that's used for conviction rate beyond a reasonable doubt. So what that means is there are times we can take action when law enforcement either chooses not to because they don't feel there's sufficient evidence, or when there may not have been a result at trial. There may have been like a not guilty. There are multiple people on our CDD where the individual was found not guilty at trial. Right. And that happens. Beyond reasonable doubt is a very high standard. The information was reported to the center. The center was able to conduct its own investigation and ultimately find that by our standard, a preponderance of the evidence, these individuals engaged in misconduct, and we're going to take action against them. And that includes permanent expulsion from sport. There was one specific case that I know of that the prosecutors, right, they had that feeling, that gut feeling was like, we think something happened. We didn't get the result we anticipated at trial. We're going to cooperate with the center. We're going to provide documents that we can get you in touch with those victims so you can continue your investigation. We ultimately found that the misconduct occurred, that this, adult individual involved in sport had sexually abused multiple minor athletes within the context of sport. We were able to remove from sport. We made our findings, permanent expulsion. He challenged that through arbitration, right? And as you could imagine, his argument was, I've already been tried, not once, but twice for these allegations of abuse, and I've been found not guilty in multiple courts. It's not right for the U.S. Center for Safe Sport to come in and now remove me from sport and make findings on something I've been found not guilty on. It didn't work out for him, right? Those independent arbitrators we use upheld the center's findings, and this individual has been removed from sport permanently. So we try to be a great resource for those individuals when something like that may have occurred. We also have been exploring the opportunity to use CAC facilities across the country. So as Brian told you earlier, we really do prioritize these cases that involve minor claimants, especially if there are allegations of sexual abuse involving an adult within the context of sport. This is a core mission of the center. And so we've been exploring opportunities to be able to get those claimants into a really safe and controlled environment, even if the CACs can't conduct the forensic interviews because of our status as a private organization. We've found a lot of them more than willing to try to coordinate or collaborate with us in different ways. And that's a great way, right? Because it does help those individuals feel safe, just given the resources and how those CACs are set up. So we've seen, some of that happening across the country. We've also been working with law enforcement and CACs to alert the center of charges. What I said to you earlier was if someone is charged with a crime, it isn't a per se violation of the Safe Sport Code. We don't have to investigate those charges. We do not have to wait until that individual is convicted of those charges. We can take action immediately, which makes sense when you think about the fact that charging someone usually uses a standard very similar to preponderance of the evidence standard, right? So we're able to use that. And we've been working with different prosecutor offices across the country so that they know if someone's involved in sports, that they have an indication that the individual they just charged with some type of offense, maybe a coach, maybe an athlete, maybe an administrator within any type of sport, they've gotten in the habit of reporting that to us, so that we can look into it and see, is this person a participant? Because if they are, we can remove them from sport immediately. So while that charge is pending, action is being taken against that individual. So it's a great opportunity for collaboration. And what we've seen is most law enforcement officers or prosecutors are more than willing to do that once they understand who we are the type of individuals that make up the center itself, what the center's core mission is, and what we're doing. And they're like, you know what? Absolutely. So now we get, pretty regular reports from district attorneys from across the country who are saying, hey, we just charged John Smith with, sexual assault of a child. And it's our understanding Mr. Smith may be involved in sports. So we wanted you guys to be aware of it so you can take action if necessary. That's the type of cooperation that we're really trying to facilitate in Colorado and other states across the country. Sharing of documents. This is a big one for us, right? Because it fits with what we ask from law enforcement and what law enforcement asks from us. So we're always trying to open up those lines of communications. So if law enforcement isn't able to charge someone, that they're willing to turn over documents to us so that helps facilitate our investigation, but also so that law enforcement knows that if we're conducting an investigation, we want to make sure that we're not doing anything to impede or negatively impact law enforcement investigation. So we're always reaching out to law enforcement and saying, hey, we've got a case on John Smith. Are you going to move forward with your case? Do you want us to move forward with ours? We've already conducted interviews. Do you want copies of those transcripts? Anything and everything we can do to kind of facilitate those lines of communication just to get a better result for sport and for the community as a whole. And then finally, like I was talking about earlier, we are those additional options when you see no bills, not guilties, declinations of charges. We see a lot of those, right? Like that's one of the things we hear from forensic interviewers at CAC is like, hey, I did the forensic interview on this child. It was pretty egregious conduct. I know law enforcement isn't going to charge. I provided your information to this family. And, and hopefully they'll be able to report this to you so that maybe some action is able to be taken against this individual so that, you can mitigate risk or that, there's some level of resolution, even if it's not going to be in the criminal justice system. We've seen that, right? It's law enforcement, it's CACs across the country, it's victims advocates, it's anyone who has interactions with these individuals who there's allegations of abuse that they've been subjected to, that we're that potential avenue of resolution. And that temporary measures piece is also important as well. Understanding that we can come in and mitigate risk through temporary measures, even when there's a law enforcement process ongoing. So making sure CACs, can communicate with their members of their NDTs, or law enforcement or district attorneys know that the center's out there. And if there's an individual who they're investigating for allegations of abuse, and that individual has any relationship to sport, that the U.S. Center for Safe Sport may be able to take action, right? It goes back to Fellers. It goes back to Fritz. These are individuals who are now charged. And, at least one of them right now is going to be convicted of engaging in sexual abuse within the context of sport, where months or years before the charges came, the center was able to take action in coordination with law enforcement to remove that potential avenue of abuse. So all of these are just potential ways that we're looking at coordinating and collaborating with organizations across the country, right? We also work really closely with NCA, so National Children's Alliance, NCAC down in Huntsville with so we work closely with them. They do training for us. We do, we speak at their presentations. We're coordinating with, the National Attorney Association of Attorney Generals across the country. We're running pilot projects with USA attorney offices across the country. So all of these different ways of making sure people know who Safe Sport is and how we can work together. And I think this is a really important kind of aspect of where, COVA comes in and being, another one of those organizations within Colorado. We're here, we're based here. So we're wanting to make sure that we do everything we can to really engage with organizations around here. I'll tell you, like, for example, the Denver District Attorney's Office, we're going to do some training for them so they understand who we are, how we can be a resource, all of that. We do these types of presentations so we can be a resource for everyone, on this call and all the people you may serve as well. So I appreciate all the time this morning. I see some questions in the chat, so I'm going to jump on there, read some of those out, drop, if anybody on here can drop message on the chat, more than happy. We will make sure that the contact information for myself, Brian, and Jocelyn is available. We love to field questions from you guys or facilitate or coordinate times to talk, just so we can really get out there who we are, what we're doing, and how we can really work together to just impact and mitigate that risk or eliminate risk across the country. So, all right, let's see what we got here. This is a good question. Do adult survivors have the option of reporting the safe sport without involvement of law enforcement? For example, if they are only wanting community victim advocacy, mental health services, but do not wish to continue with sport and have the perpetrator sanctioned in some way. Yeah, absolutely. We see a lot. Now, we are mandatory reporters. So if that individual was a minor at the time of the abuse, we're going to make that mandatory report to law enforcement. But one of the great things about the U.S. Center for Safe Sport is we are able to take action, adult to adult misconduct, right? And so what we see a lot, hey, look, this is what happened to me. I don't want this, I'm not ready for this guy to go to prison, or I don't want to be involved in the criminal justice system. I don't, any of that. What can you do? We see a lot of those cases, and we will take action. And then we also have a couple unique positions that are available that we have on staff, which are known as the resource and process advisors. So that kind of go to that second part of the question, right? It's like, okay, so if they don't want law enforcement involvement, can you still take action, investigate, and sanction that individual? Absolutely, right? Like just that 100% we can do that. We also use our resource and process advisors to make sure that individuals that are involved in the process or have been involved in the process have support, right? That answer questions with regards to what do you expect from the process? So, how does an interview go? How long do investigations last? What are the steps of, arbitration, any of that? We want to make sure they're aware of what's going to happen, so they have expectations. But then also we want to make sure that we coordinate with resource providers across the country, right? We have created a library of resources that have resources from every state across the country. So where if someone calls us and they're looking for some kind of community victim advocate or mental health resources, we can, facilitate those resources to that individual. We're not mental health providers ourselves. What we want to make sure, though, is someone calls us from Alabama and they're saying, they seem to be in crisis, so they need, some level of mental health assistance. We have people on a list or organizations on a list that we can coordinate contact with them. We've been working with the American Association of Social Workers in Sport, trying to make sure I get that acronym or that title right, because I'm thinking through the acronym, which is made up of licensed clinical social workers from around the country who are getting certifications in assisting individuals who have been potentially abused or suffered abuse within the context of sport, because that can create its own unique dynamic or issues that need to be addressed. So working with them to really make sure that we're supporting people through the process, but that we're also making sure that there are resources available to that person after the process as well, because we do everything we can to maintain a truly trauma-informed process. We, all the trainings, making sure our people are aware of how to conduct that. But no matter what we do, we also understand that this is a difficult process for people. So we support them through the process and after the process as well. So that was a really great question. So with that,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
As a follow-up on that question, adult survivor doesn't want to report, but if I know you handle the Paralympics too as well, right? So if we're under a statute of, if they could fall under at-risk adult, that also becomes mandatory reporting for you in that scenario. Would that be correct?
That is true, right? So we do report to like adult protective services, law enforcement, things of that nature as well. So it's great. So we do explain that on the very front end, right? Of telling people like, listen, we are mandatory reporters, so we're going to report this to law enforcement. It is not, it is their decision to whether or not they wish to work with law enforcement or not. We always tell them like, we're going to empower you in whatever way we can. And if you choose to work with law enforcement or not, we're still going to be an option for you. We do see that within the Paralympic sports as well, of at-risk youth, adults as well, that we make those mandatory reports. But yeah, so it's a really kind of unique option. And one of the other unique things about the center is our mandatory reporting requirements. So on the front end, I will tell you, no claimant, so an individual who's a victim has no obligation to report any misconduct that they have suffered, right? That's not what that's, but not only do we require mandatory reports for child abuse, like you would see mirrored in the, the criminal justice system, so legal obligations, we also require adult participants to report any type of emotional and physical abuse, regardless of whether it rises to the level of child abuse. So it can be adult to adult or adult to minor that doesn't rise to child abuse. That still has to be reported either to us or their NGB. We also require adult to adult sexual misconduct to be reported to the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. Our idea is all of these types of abuse need to be eliminated from sport. So we're able to put an obligation on those adult participants that if they know of or reasonably suspect abuse, whether it's emotional and physical, sexual, adult to adult, adult to minor, that they're reporting it to the center, even if they don't have an obligation to report it to law enforcement, so that we can investigate and resolve those allegations to make sure we're really doing everything to eliminate all types of abuse within the Olympic movement. So we've seen that a lot of people find that very, very helpful because they don't always have an avenue with law enforcement, right? And they may have an avenue with us, which is just a great alternative. And again, that's why we're trying to get who we are and what we do out there, because with this webinar, if we get 1 or 2 reports more than we would have received without posting this webinar, or get contact from somebody who wants to know who we are or what we're doing, then it's a huge success for us.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that. Is really the first part of our process is going to be reaching out to those claimants or victims and talking through whether they want to participate. So while folks are mandated to report to us, there's no obligation for victims to participate in our process either. The hope is we get those reports so then we can make direct contact with those folks and talk through options and resources and things like that. So I want to also clear that up. And you also had a question about whether we have victim advocates. We don't. We have resource process advisors who provide resources and referrals. What we found is the direct service, being a national organization, is really difficult because all of our folks are based in Denver. So right now we've been trying to connect with CIC's advocacy organizations to then make sure that we've got appropriate folks in their area to provide direct service as needed.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So first off, yeah, you're exactly right. Participation with our process is absolutely optional to claimants. And if a claimant chooses not to participate, which we see for a variety of reasons, we respect that choice that those claimants make, and we tell them, if at any point moving forward you do wish to come back to the Center for Safe Sport and participate, we will absolutely reopen this case and move forward with that investigation. We do not have victim advocates on staff, so we are a neutral organization. We do provide resource and process advisors available to anybody that's within the process to answer those questions, to direct them to resources that may be appropriate. We also have built into the code that any individual any respondent or a claimant that's involved in our process can have an advisor with them when they're talking with Safe Sport. So we build in some ways. So some people choose to bring an attorney, other people choose to bring an advocate, whoever it may be, so they can build up their own support system as well. So we have that as what is written in the code. They're going to have that opportunity. And so even though we're not able to provide advocates to those victims, we're going to do what we can to ensure that they're supported through the process, through our RPA, and making sure that they have the ability per the code to bring an advisor of their choosing with them throughout the entirety of the process, right? And some people choose to have that advisor receive the communications from the center, choose to have them present when they're doing interviews or any of that. So we do everything we can to support them before, during, and after the process. And that's one of the ways, as Jocelyn pointed out, that we found really works well with those individuals.
Can I ask a follow-up question on the arbitration? Say the person was found not guilty at trial and is then, arguing about being on your database. Does the victim or claimant need to be a part of that arbitration process?
Yeah, great question. The answer is usually yes, they are a part of the arbitration process. So what is interesting is we don't have rules of evidence the same that exist in the court system. So hearsay evidence, all of that is a bit different for what we have, but we are able to proceed forward in some cases without it. But what we found is when a case gets to arbitration, we explain very early on to a claimant that if this case does arbitrate, they may be asked to participate. So we set those expectations. We do have some built-in safeguards to ensure they can choose to be questioned by the arbitrator instead of like the attorneys involved in the process. So some of those kind of built-in protections as well. We have a pretty strong rape shield for those who understand what a rape shield is, to make sure that any type of sexual history that a claimant may have is not admissible, and they can't talk about those types of allegations, so they're not, blasted when they if they choose to participate in arbitration. So with all that said, we do have federal obligations to provide due process, fair notice to a respondent. So what that means is there are some parallels to the criminal justice system with regards to basically a hearing. And a lot of the times we present our strongest case by bringing that claimant forward and allowing them to essentially tell their story to that arbitrator, so the arbitrator understands what has happened with them.
Follow up there. If the claimant is 12, is it the parent? Is it going through the parent, or is the 12-year-old, as they would testify in a criminal trial, are they the ones talking to the arbitrator?
So that's a great question. I think usually what we've done and handled a couple ways, depending on the age of the child, the allegations, the comfort level of the child. They're not subject to questioning. We can say they're not subject to questioning, and we can use the transcripts if we decide to from like their interview with us as that evidence, right, to really shield that child from being questioned. We have at times really put that child up there depending on what the parents and that child decide, because of how impactful that can be, but also understand how difficult and impactful it can be on that child to be up there. So we have some wiggle room that doesn't really exist in the criminal justice system. I mean, I don't think I mentioned this, I am an attorney by trade. My background is in criminal defense. I was a criminal defense attorney for a number of years, including a public defender down in Alabama. So I used to see those cases when, it falls apart if that 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old is unwilling, unable to testify at trial. And I get it, right? That's extremely difficult to do. We have a little bit different opportunities at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, because we have built into the code that if it's that child, you're not going to get a chance to cross them, and we can use the materials from their interview in place of them at trial. So.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I did have was sent a couple questions by advocates who couldn't be here today. I think you've mostly addressed it around the fact that you're a neutral organization who doesn't have victim advocates. The concern as it was put to me is you have someone who's maybe, cold calling a kiddo or an adult. But Jocelyn, you mentioned your background is in victim assistance. If you feel it hasn't been covered, can you talk any more about how, we're being trauma informed in that way, since a victim advocate isn't necessarily initially involved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that was the importance of getting, especially within the intake team, a really heavy focus on advocacy experience for that exact reason. So we don't reach out and connect with minors unless there's some specific reason, i.e. if they reach out directly to us because their parents don't know, we're going to try to bridge the gap there. But we typically connect directly with the parents. And we've got a whole kind of set process. We lean on our resource and process advisors if there are mental health concerns, those kind of things. But yeah, we're not cold calling folks unless, like I said, there's some really significant reasons and urgency to that. But yeah, we reach out. All of our folks have crisis training, victim advocacy experience, child protection experience. So we do have that kind of process and way about just how you all may get a referral from either prosecutor's office or law enforcement. That's how we did it back in King County. There is a certain point where you're reaching out and there's going to be either they don't know or they know something's coming, but not quite understanding what it is. And we're just talking through and adapting. So if that's overloading them with information so they have all these options, or if it's a slow roll of just talking through just generally who we are and kind of spending some time in our feelings and answering questions, or if it's just an email with resources and then they can call us if they want to participate. So we have kind of all of these different tools that we use similar to advocacy in the way that we're reaching out to folks and making sure we're not calling them every week for the next 6 months to make sure that they want to participate with our process. So hopefully that sheds a little bit more on it too, as far as our approach.
Yeah, thank you. I have folks who want to watch the recording, so I'll appreciate that. Thanks so much. All right, any other questions? And yeah, do you want to drop contact information in the chat? And for participants, use the second certificate of attendance, not the first one. I would like to blame it on the computer, but as the IT people cleverly like to say, it's a FEBCAC, a fatal error between share and keyboard.
Great, perfect. Yeah, so I dropped my email in the chat. I always encourage people to reach out. I'm just happy to engage in conversation. So Brian's dropped his in the chat. It's a great opportunity. We appreciate the time this morning. If anybody has any questions, concerns, follow up, reach out to us. We'll answer via email. We'll set additional time to talk with any individuals. We just appreciate the opportunity to get this up. So really, yeah, just really a good thank you, and appreciate the time, and hope to hear from some of you people, and maybe the snow will melt at some point since we're all in Colorado. So.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop the recording, but for folks who are still on, they'll still be able to grab info out of the chat.